Somewhere in California, in the autumn of 1991, a family gathered to mourn one of their own. They wept. They held each other. They asked the question every grieving family asks. Why? What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the answer to that question was sitting in the very same room, eating from the same plate, sharing in their grief, calling himself family. Her name was Danielle Claus. She was 23 years old, and for more than a decade, the truth about what happened to her remained buried, hidden inside a family tree, so tangled, so painfully close, that investigators kept looking right past it. The killer wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't some faceless monster who disappeared into the night. He was a branch on the very same family tree. And uncovering the truth would require a scientific tool that didn't even exist on the night Danielle died. For 13 long years, her family waited. Investigators searched. The evidence sat quietly in storage, waiting for science to catch up. This is Blood and Branches, based on true events. California, 1991 to 2004. To understand what was lost the night Danielle Claus died, you first have to understand who she was. Not the victim in the case file, not the name on an evidence box, the person. Danielle grew up in Northern California, in one of those small towns that feels like the whole world when you're living in it, and like almost nothing once you've left. She was the kind of person people remembered, not because she demanded attention, but because she gave it. She listened in that rare, wholehearted way that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. Those who knew her remembered a laugh that seemed to spread to everyone around her. The kind of laugh that could brighten an ordinary afternoon without her even trying. By her early 20s, Danielle had built a life that was modest by some standards, and enormous by the ones that truly matter. She worked. She paid her own bills. She stayed close to her mother, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to. She had dreams she hadn't spoken aloud yet. Plans that were only beginning to take shape. A future that, in October of 1991, seemed completely within reach. And then, on one ordinary autumn night, everything stopped. In the early 2000s, cold case investigators across California began doing something that hadn't been able to do just a few years before. They started going back. Back to old evidence. Back to forgotten files. Back to biological samples that had been carefully collected, carefully preserved, and quietly waiting inside evidence rooms for science to finally catch up. The Danielle Claus case had something priceless. Biological evidence. Collected on the night she was murdered, handled with care, stored correctly, never discarded. When investigators submitted those samples for newer DNA testing, the results were remarkable. The profile was clear. Complete. A genetic fingerprint belonging to the person who had killed Danielle Claus. It was the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for. And it was only possible because someone, back in 1991, had done everything exactly right. Evidence that had once seemed ordinary had suddenly become the most important piece of the entire investigation. There was only one problem. When the DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, it came back with no match. No convicted offender. No known suspect. Nothing. A match would have ended the investigation overnight, but a lack of a match didn't mean the killer had vanished. It meant only one thing. Whoever had killed Danielle Claus had never had his DNA entered into the system, which meant investigators would have to find him the old-fashioned way. Without a name attached to the DNA, detectives returned to the case with fresh eyes. Old witness statements were read again. Every interview was reviewed. Every timeline was rebuilt. People who had been questioned back in 1991 were contacted again. Some had moved away. Some had forgotten details. Others remembered things they hadn't considered important at the time. Sometimes that's what solves a cold case. Not one dramatic discovery, but dozens of tiny pieces that finally begin to fit together. Investigators studied Danielle's relationships. her friends, her routines, the people who had access to her life. One fact kept appearing, again and again. The person responsible probably wasn't a stranger. The crime suggested familiarity. Someone who knew Danielle. Someone she trusted enough not to fear. Someone close enough to move through her life without attracting attention. That realization changed everything. The investigation became smaller, more focused, more personal. And slowly, one particular name began appearing more often than the others. Detectives didn't rush. After waiting more than a decade, there was no reason to make a mistake now. They quietly investigated the man whose name kept resurfacing. They reviewed where he had been in October of 1991. They compared old statements. They looked for inconsistencies. Then came the final step. Investigators legally obtained a DNA sample connected to their suspect. The sample was sent to the laboratory. Scientists compared it with the DNA profile recovered from Danielle's murder scene. Marker by marker, sequence by sequence. The comparison continued, every result pointing in the same direction. Then the report came back. It was a match. Not a possibility. Not a strong likelihood. A match. After more than a decade of unanswered questions, the science had finally spoken. The man investigators had been searching for all these years wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone passing through town. He was someone Danielle already knew. Someone connected to her life in a way that made the betrayal even more devastating. For 13 years, he had lived as though nothing had happened. Now, that silence was about to end. A DNA match doesn't end an investigation. It begins its final chapter. Detectives moved carefully. Every report was reviewed. Every piece of evidence was documented again. Every chain of custody was verified. Because they knew what came next. An arrest, a courtroom, a jury. The science would tell them who. The evidence would explain how. But there was still one question left unanswered. The question Danielle's family had been asking since 1991. Why? That answer would finally emerge when the man at the center of the case was forced to face investigators. The morning of the arrest looked like every other morning on that street. That is the thing about ordinary neighborhoods. They absorb extraordinary events without flinching. The lawns are the same. The driveways are the same. The coffee maker in the kitchen is the same. Only one thing is different. Investigators had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous care that had defined the entire investigation. Every detail confirmed. Every document in order. Every officer briefed on exactly who they were dealing with. A man who had lived with a secret for 13 years. A man who had, by every visible measure, built himself a normal life over the bones of what he had done. The door opened. There was no chase, no standoff, no moment of cinematic confrontation. There was simply a door, and a man who had perhaps spent years telling himself that what happened in 1991 was buried, finished, unreachable, suddenly face to face with the fact that it wasn't, that it had never been. You think about that moment a lot. Beforehand, you run through scenarios in your head, but when it actually happens, it's quiet, almost anticlimactic. He didn't look surprised exactly. He looked resigned, as though some part of him had always known this day was coming. He was taken into custody, booked, charged, and somewhere across California, a family's phone rang, and the voice on the other end said, simply, "We got him." For the family, there was no single clean emotion in that moment. There was relief, yes, but there was also something heavier, the strange, disorienting weight of finally knowing, after carrying the not knowing for so very long. The trial that followed was, in its own way, a second grief. Every detail of Danielle's death, the violence of it, the fear she must have felt, the ordinary evening that became the very last thing she ever experienced, was laid out in a courtroom, made official, made part of the public record. Her mother sat in the gallery, every single day. The defense, as expected, challenged the genealogical evidence. The methodology was relatively new. It hadn't been tested extensively in California courts. They argued that identifying a suspect through distant DNA relatives introduced too many variables, too many opportunities for the wrong branch of a family tree to lead to the wrong conclusion. The prosecution answered with science. They walked the jury through the entire process, step by step. The initial DNA match from the Ancestry database, the months of painstaking archival research, the elimination of every other candidate, the narrowing until only one name remained, and then the final and most direct comparison, a discarded DNA sample from the defendant, matched against the original crime scene profile from 1991. Not similar, not close, identical. Defense attorneys will always challenge new science. That's simply their job. But the strength of genetic genealogy was never really in any single step. It was in the totality of it. Hundreds of data points, all pointing, without exception, toward the very same person. The prosecution also presented everything collected back in 1991, evidence that had sat quietly in storage for 13 years, waiting for this exact moment. Assembled together, with the DNA match at its center, it left very little room for reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated. Deliberations lasted several days. For the Claus family, those days were almost unbearable. They had waited 13 years for this moment. And now, having come this far, they were asked to wait just a little longer. That voice in the back of your head, the one that's been disappointed before, the one that's lived with no answers for so long, it doesn't go quiet easily. It keeps asking, even now, even this close, what if it isn't enough? The jury returned. The foreperson rose. The verdict was read. Guilty. In the gallery, someone wept. Not from sorrow alone, though there was certainly plenty of that woven through the room, but from something else entirely. The sense, at long last, that Danielle's story, though it had ended far too soon, now finally had a complete telling. I've worked a lot of cases over the years, seen a lot of verdicts come down. That one, I won't pretend I didn't feel it. You spend years carrying a case like this. You think about the victim constantly. You think about the family. When it finally goes the right way, you feel it, all the way through. He was sentenced to prison. The man who had shared a family tree with Danielle Claus, who had moved within the same circle, who had, perhaps, stood at a funeral and watched her family grieve, all while knowing, completely, what he had done. Justice, when it finally arrives in cases like this, is never clean. It doesn't give back what was taken. It doesn't restore the 23 years of life Danielle never got to live. It doesn't fill the shape of her absence at the family table. What it does offer, what it can offer, is something that had been impossible for 13 long years. An ending, a name, permanently attached to a crime, an acknowledgement, official and lasting, that what happened to Danielle Claus mattered, that she mattered, and that the person responsible would carry the consequences for the rest of his life. I went to her grave after the verdict came down. I needed to tell her myself. I said, "We found him, Danielle." It took a long time, but we found him. I don't know if she could hear me. I like to think she did. I told her she could finally rest. The Danielle Claus case became one of the early landmark examples of investigative genetic genealogy successfully closing a cold case in California. It joined a growing body of cases where DNA evidence, ancestry databases, and painstaking genealogical research converged to deliver answers that conventional investigation alone could never have reached. What a case like this proves, what cases like it keep proving again and again, is that time doesn't always protect the guilty. He had 13 years, a normal life, no record, no suspicion, every reason in the world to believe he had gotten away with it completely. He was wrong. As of this broadcast, investigative genetic genealogy has been used to solve more than 500 cold cases across the United States. California has since established formal legal and ethical guidelines for its use in criminal investigation. Guidelines built in part on exactly what was learned from cases like this one. The technique remains far from uncontroversial. Questions of consent, questions of privacy. Whether submitting your own DNA to an ancestry website means you've also consented to help identify a distant relative to law enforcement, These are real, ongoing debates, still being worked through in courtrooms and legislatures across the country. But for families of the unsolved dead, those debates can feel almost abstract. I don't know all the legal details. I don't know all the science behind it. What I know is that my family spent 13 years not knowing. And then, because of people who simply refused to give up, and because of this new tool, we finally found out. That matters. Whatever the larger debate is, that matters. There are still thousands of families across America living in that particular kind of purgatory, still carrying their own unanswered question, still setting a place, in their hearts, for a story that hasn't finished yet. They are waiting, just as Danielle's family once waited, for the science to finally catch up to the cruelty. And increasingly, it does. Danielle Claus was 23 years old. She had a mother who loved her deeply, friends who still hear her laugh in quiet, unexpected moments, plans and dreams she never got the chance to finish. She did not deserve what happened to her. And now, at long last, the man who did it carries a verdict of his own. A sentence, a consequence permanent enough to outlast whatever story he told himself, quietly, for 13 years. Danielle was found. And then, in the only way still available to her, she was given justice.